freedom of the press is certainly about journalism and disseminating news, but it's about disseminating information. And that is really what social media is about. I mean, news is a construct. Journalism is a construct. It's something we, assign to, related to, something that's timely and so forth. But information is something that we all interact with. You don't need to be a journalist to disseminate information.
Welcome to Well Said, Finger Lakes, the podcast where we speak with businesses, organizations, and interesting people from in and around the Finger Lakes region of New York State. My name is Jeremiah Craig, and we're here in the live room at Well Said Media in Ithaca, New York. Our guest today is an award-winning, world-traveling, independent journalist, a journalism coach, and an editor now based in Ithaca, New York. Please welcome Jennifer Karchmer. How's it going, Jennifer?
Great.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you for having me here today. Appreciate it.
I'm really excited to talk journalism, editing, and just Finger Lakes region and Ithaca. But I kind of want to start with journalism and how you got started there. Could you give us how you got started in journalism and what inspired you to pursue it as a career?
Thank you for asking. I attended Ithaca College many moons ago in the late 80s and early 90s, so I'm a graduate of the Park School of Communication. In fact, the Park School of Communications opened in 1989, and I graduated in 1991. So that means I was part of one of the first classes that actually graduated. Journalism was something that it wasn't difficult for me to choose, mainly because I was a youngster who asked a lot of questions. I liked to write, and so my parents had suggested it as a major, and it's just fit me very well. I mean, when I graduated, I went right into journalism, and today, 35 years later, I am still a journalist. At that time, I actually worked in radio. My major was in broadcast journalism, so I had studied quite a bit working at VIC radio, WICB radio, the college campus stations, doing a little bit of television as well. But I had started in radio. I'm from the Hudson Valley, so I worked for a variety of radio stations as a reporter. And it's funny because the major up at Ithaca College changed from TVR, TV radio, to TVDM, meaning digital media. And I don't think radio's dead. I still like radio, but obviously podcasting is the audio portion of that. But journalism has been a perfect fit for me as a person. I do often say to myself, if I wasn't a journalism major, I would probably have studied law and gone to law school, which still isn't off the table. It's always a possibility. But it definitely fit my personality, my interest in writing and telling stories. And today I've kind of morphed into a freedom of the press advocate as well. So we can talk about that too.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that as well. And that kind of leads into my next question here, because I saw on your website that you have certain philosophies and approaches to journalism. Could you sort of explain what those are and what they mean to you?
Wow, you've done your homework like a good reporter.
I'm trying.
I really appreciate that. So, I like to describe it this way. I started off as a beat reporter, which basically means covering local news, being on deadline, having that regular pace, working in a newsroom, and it's very exciting. And, as a cub reporter, you're a little bit nervous, but, you eventually, get your hold and work through it. At some point, I then morphed into what I call as a journalist. And it just was sort of like a developmental, maturity within the profession and the career. And it just meant that I was a little more comfortable in my storytelling. I would write more long form than like a quick hit or a quick deadline story. And really understanding like the ethics and sourcing and what does off the record mean. And then at another point that I am now in my career as a journalist, I call myself a writer. Now, a reporter, writer, journalist, they can be used interchangeably. They have overlap. They can also be different things. But truly, I wear the hat as a writer in that I have a foundation in journalism, in nonfiction storytelling and interviewing. But I feel most comfortable calling myself as a writer because I've been published, and that's in my blood. So is beat reporting. It's been many years since I've actually covered an election night. I've certainly followed it as a good citizen, but I spend many a nights and many a years in a busy newsroom. Up till midnight, checking the returns, reporting on them. and, doing that kind of daily breaking news. And it is very exciting, and it's created a foundation within my career. But today I'm able to step back a little bit and choose the assignments that are most important to me, that I can write long form and maybe spend either several weeks or even several months covering them and, being a little more investigative. And that is really exciting to me.
Yeah, that is exciting. And you also mentioned earlier the freedom of the press work that you do. Are there particular stories or topics that you're passionate about covering?
Freedom of the press is something that, like, when you're in college, you're like, oh, there's the First Amendment and,
Right.
Press freedom. And, of course, it's an important thing, but you don't really understand it until you're actually on the front lines, working as a reporter, and realize how important the press, not me personally as a journalist, but that I'm in the role of working for the press, which is really working for the public. So it was around the year 2010 where I happened to be living on the West Coast, but I had a very big interest in also going to France and spending time in Europe. And I coupled that with an interest in an organization called Reporters Without Borders. And I bring it up because it's actually Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a Paris-based, French-based organization. And it has offices throughout the United States and around the world. But having that interest in France and speaking French, in press freedom, and then Reporters Without Borders, and again, at that time in my career, as morphing into a journalist and really understanding and being more comfortable and confident, as a reporter and journalist, I got really interested in press freedom around the world, and not only in the United States. So my travels took me to Iceland, which is maybe a bizarre place to go. But I'll tell you very briefly why it took me there. The Reporters Without Borders puts out an annual index of press freedom every year where they rank countries by a reporter's ability to do their job unencumbered. So in other words, how free is the press? And Iceland, for like 10 years in a row, was either number one or at least in the top 10. So I thought, well, I'm not currently employed by a large organization like the New York Times or CNN where I would have the protection and backing. I was a freelancer at the time, and I thought, well, I don't think I'm in a position to go to a place like Syria or Pakistan or Cuba or Russia or China, which are all places where reporters are considered censored, and the situation is much more dire. I thought, what if I go to the other end of the spectrum and go to a place that's considered more safe? I absolutely loved it. It snowed every day, and it was, and the Icelandic people were so welcoming and excited. Obviously, they speak English everywhere in the country, in addition to speaking Icelandic, but they understand that tourists and Americans don't know Icelandic, and it's very difficult to pick up in just a short trip. But I was there for 6 weeks, and the opportunity afforded me to meet with more than 25 different reporters, journalists, folks who work in media in Iceland, which, by the way, is a country at that time of a population about 330,000 people. Wow. So Reykjavik, the capital, has about 100,000 people, which, if you think, some of our college campuses on this in this country have, 60 or 70,000 students. Anyway, that brought me to Iceland and really opened me up to learning about other countries. And certainly they consider themselves very free. In fact, many of the journalists I met had either studied in Europe or in England, let's say, or the United States, and attended grad school at Columbia University Journalism School in New York, which is one of the, if not the most prestigious journalism schools in our country. And they look to the United States as a bastion of press freedom. They say you have Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein and the New York Times and the First Amendment. And we look to you as a bastion, but also as somewhat of a barometer. So if something's going on in the United States, we need to be aware of that. They consider themselves to be a free country. It's fairly safe. But at the same time, there are levels of censorship. There are reporters being sued or threatened to be sued for libel. And those are ways that either large companies or people with money can censor reporters and at least sort of threaten them to step back and kind of create a chilling effect. With that, many years later, I also went to South Africa, and again, another self-designed project for about 3 weeks there, and I connected with fellow journalists who, welcomed me to sit in as a guest editor and again study and share with them what it was like to be in the United States, but also to learn what is it like in your country to be a journalist.
Yeah, that's really cool, and it's sounding like these types of culture stories, being immersed in other cultures and speaking with those journalists is something that you're very passionate about. And you've been all over the world, like you've said, reported on different events in one country to another. But one of my interests is in the storytelling of those news events that happened in those countries. How do you craft a story from one culture to another culture so that it's understood that there are different contextual circumstances based on that culture, from me reading it here in the United States, say in Iceland, so that I understand how everything is affected based off of their social norms, mores, contextual things to their culture? How does that work? How do you think about that with storytelling?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm glad you brought that up. It's a very sophisticated way to look at it, and I assume you're coming from a place of like, hey, I'm a consumer of news, and I'm well read and knowledgeable, and I'd like to know that. And there is something called parachute journalism. It's actually a negative term in that it speaks to those journalists who are, whether they're American or not, but typically parachute in. It's a metaphor for saying, you live in a part of the country and a big news event happens, let's say in Florida or New York or Illinois or California, and the media converges on that area. People come in from all around the world. Maybe they do a little bit of homework, but they parachute in metaphorically, and they don't really know the people. They don't really know the story. Right. They're just sort of scrambling on this like 2 or 3 day, research project where they've got cameras and microphones in people's faces. And it's a little bit of a black eye on the profession, but what it speaks to is, this sense of storytelling. And what I appreciate is that long form of getting to know a subject or spending time with him. Similarly, though, or conversely, that also brings up ethical questions of like, how close can we get to our subject? Mm-hmm. How close can we get to our source? I will say that as an adventurer, and this is a good thing as a journalist, not so much for my pocketbook, but that is when I go somewhere, I don't want to be a tourist. I want to live there. So when I did that Iceland trip, I was there for 6 weeks. So, I certainly was visiting. I'm an American. I'm not Icelandic. And I wasn't there for years and years. But I made a point of not being a tourist, mm-hmm. that I said, I'm going to live here for 6 weeks. I actually stayed in a youth hostel, and I made a point of meeting shopkeepers and the locals. And I mean, at that time of year, in the winter, it's considered off season. It was actually a perfect time to go because people have the time, and I had the time and the access to, really talk to whoever I wanted to. And so that made me feel like, I live here. I did the same when I went to Morocco in 2016. I also have what's called an ESL degree, which is teaching English as a second language, an ESL. And that took me to Morocco as an English teacher, and my goal was to live there for 9 months as a teacher and teach English, but also to interact there like I lived there. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, again, with South Africa. Again, it was a short period of time, but I wasn't interested in going to like the tourist places. I really wanted to act like I was living there. And I did. I lived with a family that was so gracious to allow me to live in their home. And with the Iceland situation, it was the kind of place where, like, I received mail even. I'd walk into the hostel and they'd say hello to me. So, it was a little bit like Cheers. Like everybody knew my name. It was very sad to leave because it was really just a magical place. I have not been in there at other times of the year, like in the summer, when it's full sunlight. So I just described to you the winter exposure has all the lack of sunlight. So I need to go back, definitely. But I try to do trips that are really more about living there and exposing myself to the life of what it would be like if I were a resident rather than a tourist.
Yeah, so it sounds like by living those experiences and then telling the story from your experiences as American and also the experiences of living in those places, that's how you can get through the storytelling of one culture to another culture.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of brings up the question, unless you've got it on your list there, about objectivity, because it's certainly something that we aspire to as journalists, but it's also a sensitive topic in that in many discussions, there's certainly biases that we all bring to any story,
Of course.
and it's impossible to be perfectly objective. But what I like to share with my students, but also fellow journalists, is in the discussion of objectivity, I think it's more about being thorough and fair. Objectivity is an ideal. We can certainly try to look at all angles, not two angles, but all angles of a story. But have I been thorough here? And I think that speaks to deadline, which is why I wanted to move to that long form. I felt like in the quick turnaround that I was working under at the mainstream media, I've worked for CNN, I've worked for the Associated Press, I've written for McClatchy and Gannett. These are some of the biggest media companies in our country that own loads of outlets. It was quite a grind of just get it out, get the story out. Whereas I felt like there was more to the story. One of the biggest things I learned having worked in mainstream media, a criticism of the news, there are plenty of them, is that we often don't do what's called the second day lead or the follow-up. We're good at the breaking news. We're good at the quick. And I'm even talking, 15, 20 years ago, before really quick digital social media wasn't even a thing. But we often were criticized by the public, but also in our own newsrooms in ways that we wanted to improve, was that we would do a story and then we're on to the next thing. There was no follow-up. And not necessarily commentary, but what did happen with that law that never got passed? Or, what did happen with that person that was, went to jail for this, crime? Or, so that is, again, where the long form really interests and entices me as a journalist.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. And I like that you brought up the quick, hits and things like that, because my next question has to do with the fact that this is another election year. I'm certain that you might have expected that I might have a question around journalism and election years, because it seems like over the past election years, there's these quick hit articles that are very shocking, almost like they're clickbait. And it kind of changes the experience of what an election year can be. As a journalist yourself, what tips could you share with me and everybody watching and listening about how to navigate the news coverage during this election year?
Well, yeah, thank you for asking. I mean, obviously that is in the news topic. And I had earlier mentioned that I had covered election at the local level many years ago. That was really a very exciting time. I worked for a variety of radio stations. I'll mention WGY, which is in Schenectady, New York, in the capital region. It's 8:10 a.m. And what's interesting about that, just a little fun fact, is that it has 3 call letters, like only a few other radio or TV stations in the country. And what that means is those are the oldest. Wow. The radio stations and TV that have 3 letters were some of the first. And then at some point, kind of like our phone numbers and area codes, they ran out of 3 and decided we better have 4. So I had worked at WGY, which really had a fantastic news team then. We're talking like the early 90s. Like we're talking like 1993 or something like that. 1995, somewhere in there. Some folks who are still in news would know. I think your question about how does the public like weed through this? What I will say is, having worked at places like CNN, which I do think is a credible news source, and I'm also thankful for the model of CNN. CNN started in 1980. I worked there in two occasions. In 1990 as an intern in Washington, D.C. I actually worked on the Larry King Live show and a variety of other shows while a student at American University. 10 years later, living in New York, I was hired by CNN Money and was a money reporter, financial reporter. So I've seen the newsroom from two different cities and at two different points in CNN history. And the model was that, we are here to give you news, 24/7. Look, the model is also capitalistic. We need to make money. What is going to get the eyeballs or the people to see it? And what's interesting about that I've learned over the years, both as a professor but someone who's worked in media, is that it's about getting the exposure for, let's say, the news outlet so that they can drive up their advertising rates. They base their advertising rates on either the number of people that they can say, the news outlet can say, I can reach 1 million people, I can reach 5 million people, or on a web page, this is how many hits we get, and therefore I can charge you that. So as long as they have the traffic, those rates are higher. Although that's also created another model where advertisers are going elsewhere and not interested in the mainstream media outlets, hence they're closing. I personally am not that interested in the news model, even though I just described some of it. But I think what it brings up is, what do I do as a member of the public, and like, where do I go for credible sources? How do I read through the muck? I would go directly to the candidates' statements. I mean, anybody can open up a web page and read what someone's platform is, because pre-election, there's such a hubbub. I mean, if you get into that and you like to listen to that on the radio or watch that type of, back and forth and see what people are talking about, but sometimes it's just, very, very charged, and, maybe it doesn't even make sense to you. But I think going direct to the source, and as a journalist, we call that a primary source. So anybody can look up a web page. I encourage people to write to or even engage with their potential candidates, many of whom want to be accessible to the public. Now, I'm talking on a local level. If you have state senators or assembly people or Congress people, they often have open houses where they travel around the area. So I think it's a question of really, going direct to the source. Community forums, I think it's helpful to know what your neighbors are thinking, and it's good to have healthy dialogue, but making up your mind based on what you see from the original source rather than, I heard. Always ask yourself, where did you hear that? Well, somebody told me that. I saw it on Facebook, or I clicked a link. Right. Where did the link originate? I do think that comments in stories, depending on where they are very enlightening. I'm very anti-censorship. I'm all for the First Amendment, and I think as long as it doesn't raise to the level of hate speech, or things where people are talking about violence against others. I think it's important that we have a healthy flow of communication.
I love that you brought up actually engaging in the community and in the process rather than just trying to keep track of every single news headline every single day. That's really, it makes me feel better, and I'm sure a lot of other people can be just like, I don't need to pay attention to every clickbait thing that I see on Facebook. And I'm also glad that you brought up the point about social media comments, whether it be in the articles or in maybe the post that the media outlet has about their story, to look through the comments. That's something that I do on some posts that I'm just like curious, what's the vibe here? Like, what are people sort of feeling about this? Is my vibe that I'm getting from this post or this article, or just the picture itself, the piece of content, the reel, whatever it may be, what's the vibe? What's the reaction? And it's always interesting to see if like you are an outlier or if you're kind of in with everybody else's feeling. And that kind of leads me to my next question about social media in journalism, since it is now 2024, because you can't talk about journalism without social media. That's what we're talking about journalism, but social media has kind of crept into the conversation, right? So it's almost like the more controversial the story, like we've been saying, the more clicks, the more the ad rev, the more this, the more that, the capitalism behind it, the attention behind it. How do you view social media's place in journalism today?
Yeah, thank you for all that setup, too, because I know social media is something that you actually handle very well and are very engaged with. And we need to recognize, where do people get their headlines? And Facebook is merely a portal. Facebook, I mean, there are some things like, Facebook, like Yahoo has a news arm to it and that kind of thing. But there's nothing wrong with having portals, like the place to go, or even like we had both brought up the thing about the comments. Now, there are things called trolls. There are people arguing or being, snippy with each other or even like more inflamed than that. It's our choice to turn that off or like, hey, this is actually pretty amusing or this is entertaining. Why I brought it up was there are times, depending on the context, where someone will put in the comments, maybe a YouTube video, well, hey, did you know that this came from this? Like maybe it's something about a song, like related to music, like something completely innocuous, or, you're watching a clip from your favorite show or outtakes from a Friends episode, which is a favorite show of mine. And someone will mention, oh, I never knew that. So in terms of disseminating information, it's wonderful. There should not be a block. I'll go back to Reporters Without Borders because, again, it's an organization that not only works for freedom of the press, but it actually changed its slogan years ago to freedom of information. Because freedom of the press is certainly about journalism and disseminating news, but it's about disseminating information. And that is really what social media is about. I mean, news is a construct. Journalism is a construct. It's something we, assign to, related to, something that's timely and so forth. But information is something that we all interact with. You don't need to be a journalist to disseminate information. So on that front, I will say that, social media is merely a platform. It's not good or bad. We've seen with the, Arab Spring years ago that it was actually something used for good. I mean, even with, the Ukraine war, Israel, it's a way that we disseminate around the world. That's a good thing.
That's kind of how I think about it, too, is that everything is a tool for the distribution of information, whether it be newspapers, radio, television, now the internet. It's all just a distribution tool, and maybe AI, artificial intelligence now, is a tool that you can add to that depending on where it goes from here. Do you have any thoughts on AI as a tool?
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's just there are always going to be new tools, which is wonderful. It's a wonderful thing about our technology. I will say that I'm just learning along with everybody else, and I think we did that with social media. In fact, just for a fun thing, we should share, when is your first recollection of using Facebook?
When I was just about to go to RIT.
So what year was it? How old were you?
2006. I was
And if
19.
it's okay, we can disclose your age.
Yeah, I graduated high school in 2005, and then my friend wanted to set up Facebooks for us so that we could connect while we were still in colleges, because he was going to Potsdam and I was going to MCC and then to RIT. So that's when we got Facebook, was around 2006, 2007, someplace around there.
Okay, I have a similar recollection in terms of the year. I was clearly in my mid-30s, but one of the first things I remember you could do was send bacon to your friend.
Yes.
Send a slice of bacon. And I thought, oh, this is so fun, because I was really I'm into a little bit of animation. I love Hello Kitty, and I loved like the cuteness of it. Now, I will rewind us even further and go back to about 1995, when I'm sitting with my boyfriend in our apartment in Albany and we get the AOL disc in the mail.
I remember those.
Pop that in,
Yeah.
you've got mail. And we were both blown away that you could, it tells you the weather, and there was a little heart that clicked on and your favorites, and yeah, you could send mail to each other, and it was just a little bit goofy, and and look where we are today.
Yeah.
So it's fun. I do that as a sort of an exercise with different things where I'm like, oh, remember when? So I think we're there with this AI thing. Again, it's a tool.
Yep.
It can be used for good, and it can also be used, are people plagiarizing work, or are they, doing bad things with it? So it remains to be seen. I don't think it's going to replace real, just like, machinery has replaced people in some aspects. But, when you go to your favorite coffee place, there is still a person who hopefully is going to greet you. Although I guess there are some machines when you push
more and
the
more
button.
at Dunkin' Donuts. You do go over to a machine instead.
Although I do love my Dunkin', but yeah, I still believe. I just don't. Look, I'm a journalist. I've studied journalism. I'm not going anywhere. Has the career and the industry compressed? Absolutely. Are there parents telling their kids, don't go into journalism, you're not going to make any money? Absolutely. Great. You know what that means is that the people who are going to choose that as a career and do it for, low pay, the difficult conditions, all the negative things we hear, they're truly committed.
Yes.
And that's what we need, are people who are truly committed to that as a career and as a decision. People don't go into journalism because they want to be rich. They want to make a lot of money. Maybe they want to see a byline. But I think they truly are committed to the ideals of storytelling and connecting with an audience and being a credible speaker in different topics.
Telling the story. So with everything that we've talked about and the fact that we're talking about a new generation of journalists coming in with all of these new tools and distribution services for these stories, what advice would you give aspiring journalists looking to make their mark on the industry in the future?
Oh, thank you for asking me that, because I currently mentor and coach student journalists, but also those who are mid-career and even a veteran and seasoned folks. And, it's interesting to see a young person who's just about to graduate who wants to work freelance. I totally get that, because after working mainstream media, I was like, hey, I want to make my own deadlines. I want to write my own stories. I don't want to work for the man. But I had worked mainstream media for 15 years, so I knew what it was like to work in a newsroom. I knew what a busy, in person. Now, of course, the pandemic has changed our workplaces through all industries, and that's also a good thing. It's wonderful to work from home in your pajamas and, again, have autonomy. But if you have the opportunity to work at a larger outlet or a mainstream media place, even for a year, put it in there. This is a generation where it's not expected that you're going to land somewhere and be there for 20 years. I mean, that even my generation was my parents were the folks who worked for IBM for 30 years, exactly. 40 years and got the pension. Times have changed for a variety of reasons that, we don't have to get into. But, hey, you put in a year in a place and you've got a pretty good understanding. Now, I'm not saying you should move in and out, because your resume is going to show that and employers may frown upon it. But try to get the experiences even from the places where you wouldn't necessarily think of going. And that goes a little bit back to maybe the social media comments and also looking at the news outlets. So the advice is, think about ideally where you want to go, or your political biases, and then do the exact opposite. And I have to say I learned this in an ethics class at Ithaca College, because if you're able to adopt and at least understand that other point of view, then you can go back to oh, okay, you've at least given that other point of view its opportunity and its time that it deserves, to then say, oh, okay, wait, no, I totally don't agree on that. And I mean, that's sort of a basic, whether it's, senior in high school or at some point in college, maybe you've, taken forensics or a debate class where, you adopt the opposing side's view. And I bring that up only for anyone going into a profession, whether it's journalism or elsewhere, is really give yourself the opportunity to not only think outside the box, but like, wow, I never thought of like going to Europe, or would I move to California, or I don't want to work for mainstream media, but you're faced with an opportunity that, could work. Why don't I just try it?
Yes.
The other thing is with job interviews, it's easy at sort of the gate to say like, no, I'm not even gonna, go for that. Let them offer you the position with all the details in front of you before you decide, like, no, it's not for me. That way you're making more of an informed decision versus like a gut reaction. Now, I do think there's something to be said for your gut reaction and how you feel. Literally, does this give you certain kind of tingles in your body? What are you experiencing when you hear a certain word or, learn about someone else's viewpoint on a topic? And that, I think, helps us really hone in on, well, what is it that I truly believe? Have I given the other side its due? And that's a little bit of the, like, due diligence. Let me try to look at someone else's, side of the story. At least hear it out. So that's a little bit of advice. I can get more into, like, actual job search, but I
think that was great. I mean, I think that having different experiences, moving someplace, having an opposing view or opposing climate, just something that's different is so good for anybody, but especially somebody who's trying to tell stories to an audience so that they can relate with and make informed decisions in their day-to-day life. I remember right out of college, I moved to Phoenix with my wife. Then 3 years later, we moved to Seattle. Then 4 years later, we moved to Boston. So being in those different cities, completely different cultures, completely different climates from where I grew up in Geneseo, New York. But to experience that, I feel like gives me a little bit more of a nation view, not a world view, but just to understand where people are coming from in general. And I feel like I can make better decisions in my life based off of just being in those areas and experiencing those different places.
Thank you for mentioning the travel, because I know we have in common Washington State. I had lived in different parts of Washington State.
Spokane, right?
Well, I was in Bellingham.
Oh, Bellingham, that's right. Yeah.
And Olympia and, kind of up and down the I-5 corridor. So, and Seattle, of course, is a wonderful destination. So we both have the Pacific Northwest in common, which is really cool. And, the thing about travel is that you've mentioned all these cities. Obviously, the culture can be different. Yeah. And I mean, they're all in the United States. But, beyond the actual travel is that what I hear you saying is, I uplifted and moved my life. I had to pack and hire a truck and move somewhere. I had to interact with a new landlord or buy a house and go through the steps of living there and, finding a place and the neighborhood and scoping out and, the climate's different. And those are the experiences that, build character.
So we talked a lot about journalism and everything, but I kind of want to shift gears here and talk about the editing portion of your work, since you do a lot with that. And we're talking about a lot of nonfiction stories here with real-world happenings, things that happen in different cultures and different countries. So I'm curious, when you're editing things, I also saw that you are editing fiction too sometimes. So how do you approach editing nonfiction to fiction? Is there any difference there, or is it always the same editing?
That's a great question. First of all, I love editing. Not every either writer or reporter is a good editor, but I will say that every editor should be a good writer. Yeah, it kind of goes that way. The reason that I consider myself not a good editor, but really a great editor, and it's not that I'm so boastful. I have worked under awesome editors in all these newsrooms I've talked about. So I am well trained. And that is really how you become a good editor. And it's not for everybody. I mean, some people are great reporters, great writers, but they're like, here, you deal with it. So around 2015, I started to do copy editing for both fiction and nonfiction. And what that meant was I started working with authors who were writing books, fiction, novels. We're talking 50 to 80,000 word, maybe 100,000 word documents.
Yeah.
And then other folks who are writing memoir. And so your question about how do you edit both or either, first of all, it's really fascinating because I enjoy both. I definitely specialize in working in nonfiction, how-to, real-life stories, memoir, and I have a particular interest in survival stories. So those are some of my niches. But I have also edited quite a bit of fiction. And what's interesting there is that we're talking about character development. As an avid reader and a writer and a journalist, I bring all of that to my editing. And so I know what makes for a good story. And I'm also very meticulous. I'm able to sweep through a manuscript and know, okay, I need to be reading for a continuity, or wait a minute, we said this character was 50 years old and now we've mentioned a date and then we mentioned their age again. Oh, wait, is that correct? And then also dialogue. Dialogue is probably one of the most difficult things that a fiction writer needs to do. Actually, you don't need to do it, but if you're going to pull off any novel you've read, there's dialogue.
Yeah.
And dialogue is merely replicating some of the work that, let's say, a journalist would do in an interview. I'd interview you, and then I would have verbatim quotes, and I'd put the marks around it, he said or she said. So that really comes from a place of journalism and how to develop dialogue, but then also really preserving the character's voice. And that also comes straight from journalism is, what is either my voice as a narrator, but also what are the voices of my sources? Am I preserving it? In journalism, when we use verbatim quotes, so in other words, if I'm going to quote Jeremiah Craig, I merely need to say he said. We learn that we don't need to really use maybe an added, but he stated, he espoused, he smiled. That introduces and infuses biases and kind of strips out a little of the objectivity. In fiction, anything goes. I can say he smiled while he said this, or he chuckled, or he stated, he added, he mimicked. That's the beauty of the fiction. But in nonfiction, just that's what he said. Let the quote speak for itself. So those are a few little differences that you would want to keep in mind. I think that there are many well-trained people who can be an editor in fiction, but that is something special that I do bring to that type of editing as a journalist. Really being able to bring like sort of this meticulousness. I worked for the Associated Press years ago. It was one of my first jobs as a journalist. And as reporters in any newsroom, you need to know what AP style is. Maybe you don't have to have it memorized, but you need to know how to use it, how to go to the book, and some of the nuances. And that tends to be a style in a lot of writing. Now, fiction, again, can have its own style. Your characters can have accents and, different ways of speaking, and narrators can express themselves. Poetry. There are no rules there. So what you need to do is, check in with the author and check in what the style is. So AP style is really more of a nonfiction or a journalistic style. And that brings me to proofreading, which is my other love. I love typos. In fact, I do a Typo Tuesday on LinkedIn where I'm looking at these mugs. Thankfully, I don't see any typos there.
Yes, thankfully, because it's the logo.
Right?
That we would be in big trouble.
But I do proofread logos. It's a little bit funny, but I have proofread for tattoos.
No.
Or headstones, monuments, anything where the error would either be very costly or very difficult to change. Obviously, if you have something digitally produced, it's on your website, and somebody knows a typo, you just go to the webmaster or the person themselves, and they can change it immediately and, resave the website. But you're talking about, we just spent $1,000 on mugs or T-shirts or signage. There are also stories about places like Macy's or large corporations that are advertising for products that were supposed to cost maybe $1,500, but the typo said $15,000. Or the other way, it was a $15,000 product that was advertised for $1,500. Well, that's what you advertise. So, depending on the legality of that. So, law firms, I mean, there are plenty of stories about typos that show up in legal papers or even written laws where they left out a word and that completely changed the legality of a contract. Right. And somebody was actually correct. It didn't have the word not in there. Mm-hmm. So proofreading is another specialty. I love finding typos. But also, I completely have an eagle eye for it. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I'm actually a not very fast reader, because I'm reading as an editor. I'm, and I'll thank my mother for this. I do with a pencil mark typos in novels and other books, not library books. I would never do that. But, it's amusing. I mean, I don't find many. Right. Thankfully, there are professional editing and publishing houses that do a good job. But, when I'm looking at a manuscript and I've been hired for that, I've got an eagle eye.
Mm-hmm. I love to hear that. That's really interesting. That they can be so similar from fiction to nonfiction, but also completely different, especially in the dialogue. Let's switch gears again and just talk about the community here in Ithaca and the Finger Lakes, because I'm very interested to hear your experiences. What are some of your favorite things about this community here in Ithaca and just the Finger Lakes region in general?
Well, just to recap, if I haven't already mentioned it, I am a graduate of Ithaca College. Mm-hmm. So I had no idea what the Finger Lakes were when I was that age. And as a college student, you really don't appreciate the region. You're very insulated. So, but my memories of being an Ithaca College student were, of course, Buttermilk Falls and all the gorges and downtown, the Commons. Yeah. I can't say I really traveled too much outside the area. And then after college, I moved away. I lived in New York City. I lived in Albany. I've lived overseas. I've lived on the West Coast. And then in 2021, I had an opportunity that just brought me back to Ithaca, partly because I was serving on the alumni board at Ithaca College. So I served a 3-year term as a volunteer with the Alumni Association. And you can do it from another location, but it just made sense to me to be closer. Yeah. I absolutely love going to athletics events. In fact, if I'm not in an Ithaca College soccer game, football game, lacrosse, swimming, volleyball, basketball, I mean, it really just depends on what time of the year. I'm actually at Cornell University doing the same thing, as a spectator. Yeah. So maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I do have in my vehicle plenty of Ithaca College garb and sweatshirts. But if I'm at Cornell, I'm wearing big red.
You traitor.
So, I mean, I'm not going to be in the stands wearing blue. I have to wear, the Cornell clothing. So, but I love my home teams. Let's be honest. When I lived in Washington State, I was a Seahawks fan. Mm-hmm. I'm back in New York. I love my Josh Allen and my Bills, which, unfortunately didn't make it. But the other beauty about living here as an adult with a vehicle is, I can go to Cortland, I can go to Seneca Falls, I can hop up to Rochester or go to Watkins Glen. And frankly, I usually do that in the fall. I literally, this is such a fun, I'll give you 2 fun things that I do in the Finger Lakes that I think everyone should do. On a beautiful Saturday with nothing else to do, a completely open agenda, I will just open a map, online. I actually have a paper map. And I'll just go, where should I go today? I'll actually look up a list of farmers markets, and, most every town has one. And I'll just go there, a 30 to 45-minute drive, get something to eat, get coffee, have lunch, walk around. Have you ever been well, first of all, I've been to Corning, and I've been to the museum there, the Glass Museum. But then also Auburn has an amazing library. It's like, I don't know the history of it. I maybe you had a guest on with that, but I mean, the historic building of the library is, I went in there because I needed to use the restroom. And then I was like, oh, I should really check out this library. Yeah. So go there. Okay. I've been to the Women's Museum in Seneca Falls, the National Hall of Fame. And I've been to Cortland quite a bit because I'm a huge baseball fan. And we have something called the Cortland Crush. It's not a minor league baseball team. In fact, it's a collegiate level wood bat summer league. In fact, if you need a guest for a future podcast and you want to talk about baseball, I'm your gal.
All right. Sounds fun.
So, I just rattled off a bunch of stuff. I'll give you one other thing that I think everybody in the area should do. Well, first of all, you should have a library card because the library rocks.
yeah.
Hello. Anytime somebody mentions a book, I go directly to my Tompkins County Library, to see if they have it.
Yeah.
And then if it's something that I'm going to take a long time to read or I want to own it, then I'll buy it. But, thank you to the library. You can reserve books on a hold. So in other words, you go to the website and you say, oh, this book is not available yet, but in 2 weeks when it's there, I'd like to pick it up. So you go ahead and click reserve hold or something like that. And 2 weeks later, it shows up. Well, where does it show up? Well, any of the libraries that are in the Finger Lakes system. Obviously, I can go to downtown to the Ithaca, the main branch, but I often go to Lansing. Sometimes I go to Cortland. Sometimes I just choose a random town or Newfield or wherever.
Yeah.
And it gives me the opportunity to do a day trip. Oh, I'm going to pick up that book. I'll go there and get coffee. Oh, I'll drive through there and see what it's like. And, I don't do that regularly because driving to some of those places is 45 minutes away. But I will say that it's a fun, free way to introduce you to another library. And you get chatting with the library clerk and, they're often, where are you based? Oh, you're coming all the way from Ithaca or, wherever you're located. Town of Caroline or Lansing or wherever. And it's such a fun way to introduce you to another place, and you get to see what other libraries are like if they have good parking. Because let's be honest, it's a little difficult to park at, let's say, a downtown, library branch. But I often go to the downtown library branch and pick up books there, and everyone there is excellent.
I love that recommendation to just visit local libraries in the community. It's free. It's fun. You get to have access to a new community to you to just sort of learn about what it's like, and then also the throwing the dart at the Finger Lakes area and just sort of, all right, I guess I'm going to Dryden today or something like that. That's really cool. I like that. That pretty much wraps up our conversation here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering if you can close us out by telling us how we can find out more about you online and possibly if anybody is interested in hiring you for your journalism or editing services.
Oh, thank you, Jeremiah. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been so great getting to know you through the chamber. I am a member of the Tompkins Chamber, like Jeremiah, so that's one way to find me. And honestly, the best way is to just Google my name. It's Jennifer Karchmer, and that's with a K, Karchmer. And I'm sure it'll be in the show notes as well.
Yes.
And so I have a website. It's easy to reach me. I am also on LinkedIn if any folks want to reach me in that way, in a professional way. And I am happy to hear from anybody who has any kind of writing project. Like I said, I've worked with authors who are writing memoir, who are writing fiction, with folks who are working on website copy, that maybe they have a blog. And because I'm a journalist, I can either ghostwrite, so that means I'm doing the actual writing. I just interview you and cull the information. Or maybe it's editing. Maybe they already have something written out, but they just need somebody's professional eyes. Proofreading, I love it. Maybe you're putting up like literal handmade signage, or you're, again, building a website. Maybe you do social media posts. Some companies actually in person are putting up banners or, have other sort of campaigns or events and things like that. So Google my name. I'm happy to hear from anybody and happy to give any kind of estimate. I'm also happy to make referrals when it's the kind of work that I don't do. I typically do not, I have, but it's not my specialty to edit children's books. Mm-hmm. I think there are many more well-trained folks who work in that genre. Again, I have, poetry. I could do it, but I think it takes a special type of editor. I'd love to see folks who really want a journalist. I've consulted with a few fiction writers who have created characters who are journalists.
Oh, cool.
One of whom is someone named A.C. Fuller, who's written a series of books with a character, the first book of which is called The Anonymous Source. And it's a character set in New York City who is a reporter. And he himself has a reporting background, the author, but I worked with him on a little bit of consultancy in that venue. So I've worked with documentary folks who are writing scripts, with folks who are working with English as second language. As I said, that's also a specialty of mine as an editor. So, yeah, I do wear many hats, but the bottom line is the written word. I do also coach folks with public speaking as well. So, that's a separate thing. And I myself have produced podcasts. So maybe I need to have you on as a guest.
That would be so much fun. I would love to do that.
This has been great fun, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jennifer. And if anybody watching or listening is interested in the services Well Said Media provides, like video and other types of media for your business, you can find out more about us at wellsaidmedia.com. Thanks for watching and listening today.